Hello and welcome to A Slice of Life R for your dose of do-it-yourself motivation. I'm Eugene Loh. Thank you so much for joining me here today. And today we're talking about loss. How can we mitigate the pain of losing a loved one or something we treasure dearly? I'll be getting some ideas from my guest, Angie Monksfield. Angie is the chairperson of Brahm Centre, a charity that offers education and activities that promote happy and healthy living. And Angie has been serving in the community space for the last 20 years or so while pursuing a career as an IT professional. She was the CIO of the Ministry of Information, Communications and the Arts and National Heritage Board, Director at the Ministry of Health Holdings and Visa International, Vice President at Singapore Airlines, and currently at NIIT Technologies. She was also an entrepreneur who sold off her IT business to a US MNC. She also served as Vice President on the Singapore Computer Society Council and President of the Buddhist Fellowship, and she has led humanitarian missions to India, Myanmar, Thailand, and Sri Lanka following natural disasters. We're talking about overcoming losing loved ones and things we treasure today, Angie. And it seems to me that, loss, it's almost, you can almost call it our destiny, because, anything we endeavor to love, in this world can be taken from us at any time, right? So it's one of the great truths or realities of life that I suppose that we constantly, are losing things, are losing people, and eventually, we lose our lives as well. Nothing is permanent in this world in that sense, right? So I'd like to ask you to start off our conversation today. What is your personal concept of loss?
Indeed, Eugene. I think we often forget that impermanence is the nature of life. Just as when we were born to what we have become now, it has been through a whole process of change. And change around us, as we have seen how Singapore has been a fishing village to a trading port to now a cosmopolitan city, we have had to lose things of the past. We've had to give up things that were old in order to embrace the new. For most part, people embrace the new because they see the advantages and the benefits. But having said that, it is always difficult to let go when we're not prepared or when we want to hold on to things that we deem dear. And that's where the pain comes from.
And it's interesting you brought up that example, right? Because very often when we think of loss as a negative thing, as in losing something or someone is painful. But in that example that you brought up, we see that loss need not be a bad thing or a painful thing.
It's just the nature of life.
It's a reality, yeah.
In a family, when you welcome a new baby into the family, there is a life that is also you're bidding goodbye to, because people, when they age, they get old, they get sick, they will die. And in the meantime, new lives come into the world, and we can't have one without the other. It's just the two ends of the same spectrum. So losing things or losing loved ones is something that we have to program our minds to be prepared for. And when the time comes, we know how to deal with the pain by acknowledging the realities of life and also seeing where that pain comes from to be able to overcome it.
So when we're talking about loss today, we're talking about, it can be the most trivial thing, like losing a phone or a pen, to losing a partner, losing a parent, losing our savings, our job, our youth even, so it's the whole range of things.
Yes, I'd just like to share this story with you. I mean, for example, someone gave you a Mont Blanc pen and you thought, wow, this is a $300 pen. I'm going to really treasure it. And after a few months you've used it and you happen to misplace it or even lost it, and you feel really, really bad. And you go back to your friend and says, that really expensive pen you gave me, the Mont Blanc, I've lost it. Isn't that terrible? And I feel so bad because you gave it to me. And then she laughs at you and says, oh, Eugene, that's all right, Actually, I bought it in Shanghai on the street for $15. And suddenly you think, it's only $15? Well, it's not a big deal anymore. But the reality is it was the same pen. The loss of that pen hasn't changed, but your entire perception has changed from, well, it's not $300, so it's not that painful. So suddenly $15 loss of a pen, it's not a big deal. So really, it's the value you put on the item that creates the pain.
Yes.
It is not the actual losing of the item, nor the pen in this case.
It's
itself.
relative, yeah. It's the value you assign, like, yeah.
Yeah, just like if you lose a handphone, if you lost it at the beginning of a new plan, it's much more painful than you lose it towards the end of the plan, or when you decide that you actually want a new handphone anyway, so it becomes your excuse to go and get a new one. So losing things is not always painful. It depends on your own perception.
Yeah, it's more of a psychological. I mean, when we talk about losing something, I mean, when we lose a limb, for example, the pain is physical, but a lot of the pain that we feel when losing things or people happens only in the mind.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because there's a really wise saying that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional, because suffering is mental. So if you got a cut on your finger, do you focus on it and says, oh, it's so painful, and that becomes mental suffering. But you say, oh, it's just a cut. Life goes on. You're bound to get pain here or there, especially when you're aging and you get pain in your back, pain in your knee. If you keep focusing on it, it becomes real suffering. But he says, hey, it's just part of my body, it's the aging process, and you just accept it and you go around just doing the things that you want to do. Sometimes you don't even think of it anymore. The pain's just gone.
Correct. So much of this suffering is, in a sense, self-inflicted, and it's why do you think we feel this pain or this suffering when we lose things or when we lose people?
Because we refuse to accept the nature of life. That we cannot hold on to people or things all the time. The moment something comes to you, you can appreciate it, enjoy it, and have fun with it. But the time will come where it will leave you, or a time will come when the person leaves you, whether he or she goes away or he or she has to pass on as part of the nature of life. Just as we have left many other people in our lives as we have moved on from kindergarten to primary school, we've left friends behind, going to secondary, university, different places we work, different relationships we've formed. We will move on too and say goodbye to those people.
So the amount or the degree of suffering that we feel corresponds with the degree of attachment that we assign to a person or a thing.
The refusal of letting go.
Yeah.
The unwillingness to accept that things will pass. This too will pass.
Well, I'm chatting today with my guest, Angie Mansfield, who is chairperson of Brahm Centre Limited. Brahm Centre is a registered charity and is dedicated to offering education programs and activities that promote happy and healthy living. And we are talking about, how to be happier by learning how to overcome, the pain of losing loved ones and things we treasure. More on this with my guest, Angie Mansfield, in just a while here on A Slice of Life Hour on 938 Live. We're talking about loss today, how to overcome the pain of losing loved ones and things we treasure here on A Slice of Life Hour on 938 Live. Do join our conversation if you have any ideas or thoughts to share, perhaps a question you'd like to, just bring up as well with regards to this particular issue. 669-11938 is our number, or you can always post your comment on the Facebook page, A Slice of Life. Search A Slice of Life under pages in Facebook. My guest is Angie Mansfield, who is chairperson of Brahm Centre, a registered charity which is dedicated to offering education programs and activities that promote healthy and happy living. And yes, earlier we were talking about the concept of loss and how it can be from the most trivial things like losing our handphones or losing a pen or losing a race, even to bigger issues like losing our job, losing our life savings. And I think losing loved ones is something that a lot of people feel very difficult to manage as well, because the pain of losing, say, a thing, you can always try and replace it, or you can a simple switch of mindset. You can say, okay, I will not allow this to bother me, at least for now. But what about losing a loved one? That is so much more difficult to manage.
Yes, I think that losing your parents, for example, is one of the hardest thing to bear. What's even harder is when you lose a child if you're a parent. But I think let's start with losing your parents first. And I think what I've observed in counseling people and even my own personal experience, I think when you lose your parent, the hardest thing to deal with is the guilt. The guilt of not having been a better daughter or a son to your parent, and he or she is no longer around for you to redeem yourself, to better the way you have been treating them. Especially when we're younger and we're more rash or less thoughtful, we may even have been harsh towards them, or our expectations of them were, if you look back, considered unreasonable, because after all, they have led their lives in a certain way, and they have certain a way of thinking, of approaching life, and we may not always be agreeable. But instead of respecting that, we may have ended up in arguments with them, or we may have even rebelled and showed our worst side. And then when you lose your parent, then you find it so hard to cope because you start to feel a lot of guilt. And I think the best way to redeem yourself is be nicer to the people who are still alive around you, because sometimes we forget to move on because we think that we don't deserve to be happy after the way we have treated them. But as you can't bring them back, nor can you turn the clock back, the most positive thing you can do is to start being kinder, more compassionate, and nicer to the people who are still alive around you. Maybe it's the other parent, or even your siblings, your uncles, your aunties, and not to dwell in the guilt. As we were talking earlier on, the hardest person to forgive is yourself.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that is very self-punishing. But we have to say to ourselves, really, we couldn't help it. Because we were young, we were foolish, and we were emotionally charged. You couldn't have done any better. I know some people say, yes, you could have, but the reality when you look back, given the conditions, given the people around you and what you were fed with mentally, that was really the best you could do. But now going forward is a different story.
Yeah.
It's how you're going to change the way you start treating people around you.
And it's
that will be different.
this forward-looking mentality that is so important, isn't it? Because very often the suffering is because we can't let go of the past.
Yes.
We are so fixated on what is already over, we can't do anything about, and yet we keep torturing ourselves, replaying that guilt and what and the regret that we feel.
Yes, and be careful of that, because people who dwell so much in the past and forget about living for the future are the ones inclined to develop dementia. When my mother passed away, my sister and I were so shocked to find a photograph of our sister who passed away when she was 4. And this is, you're talking about 40 years ago, when my little sister had passed away, and my mother never ever talked about it. But obviously she was feeling the guilt of having lost her child and dwelling in it, and she developed dementia. She couldn't cope with what's in the future or what she's eaten for the day. She was just living in the past. So I think we have to be really careful and to be cognizant that we have to move on.
She was so convinced that she had done wrong, that she was a wrongdoer, and that she was a bad person in that sense, right? In that context. She couldn't forgive herself.
That's right.
Yeah.
So she punished herself.
So that is one of the main keys to overcoming, losing loved ones, is to be forward-looking, is to think about what else you can do for the people who still exist, who are still alive.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at people who have plans for the future, who are constantly thinking about what they can do more for others. I mean, look
Instead
at Sister Teresa.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, she lived to 110? I'm sorry, I don't really remember the exact age, but, she just kept going. And you never look at her and say, gosh, can she remember anything? I mean, she was still really with it. And so these are clear signs of people who are constantly living with plans for the future, will not waste their time dwelling in the past that they absolutely cannot change.
Absolutely. So don't torment yourself with what you could have done in the past, because that's just not, salvageable anymore, So do look forward to the future and what else you can do, what positive impact you can bring to the people around you and to yourself as well. I'm chatting today with Angie Monksfield, who is the chairperson of Brahm Centre, a registered charity dedicated to offering education programs and activities that promote happy and healthy living. More information at brahmcentre.com. That is Brahm as in the composer, Brahm. And we're talking about overcoming losing loved ones and things we treasure today. More in about 15 minutes here on 938 Live, a Slice of Life Hour. I'm Eugene Loh. Thank you for joining me here on A Slice of Life on 938 Live. If it's your dose of do-it-yourself motivation. And my guest today is Angie Monksfield, who is chairperson of Brahm Centre, a registered charity which is dedicated to offering education programs and activities that promote happy and healthy living. And their regular programs and services are offered free of charge as well, so that they're accessible to all. And today, Angie and I are talking about overcoming the pain of losing loved ones and things we treasure. And of course, one of the most difficult things to overcome is that is the pain and the suffering we feel when we lose a loved one to mortality, to death. And we talked about earlier how a lot of that has to do with the guilt that we feel, and how that is actually very egocentric in a sense. It's all about us.
It is. I remember when I lost my little dog, and I cried my eyes out for a couple of days. And then suddenly I had this moment of awakening that I wasn't actually crying for my dog that died. I was actually crying for myself, because the dog is no longer around for me anymore. When I call out her name, she's not going to come running to me. If I want to cuddle her, she's no longer here for me. So this grief was really about me. And suddenly, it just struck that, gosh, I'm just so egocentric. This whole grief was about myself. My dog was free from suffering, from physical suffering, because she was suffering from diabetes. And she was actually free. I'm the one who was just inflicting myself with mental pain over the loss.
That is when we get the aha moment, that eureka moment, when we realize the authenticity of our pain, or the source of our suffering. Really, it's all about ourselves. We realize it's so self-indulgent and selfish in a sense, that we realize how pointless it is. Because most of the time we're not even thinking about, we're not sad that the person has lost the opportunity to save a life anymore. It's more about how this person is no longer around for me to be with, and for me to, I suppose, assuage my guilt in doing the things that, I should have done for this person when he or she was still alive.
Yes, that's especially the case when you lose your parents and you feel that, my parents are no longer here for me anymore. If I need help, if I want a great meal to be cooked by my mom, she's no longer here to cook me my favorite dishes or whatever that may be. And this also applies to losing a child. Your child may be very ill, or suffering from a terminal illness and passes on, and it's so difficult to let go of your child. And I've seen parents who have lost children finds it the hardest thing for them to overcome, especially if the child commits suicide or dies accidentally. And then they punish themselves, thinking that, what if they have raised their child differently? What if they have done something different, right? And this whole process of guilt just freezes them in time. And they don't want to move on.
It just intensifies and amplifies it, and with no end, because essentially you're thinking about something that you cannot do anything about anyway. And all the what ifs and could have beens and could haves are just endless scenarios you can keep playing in your mind.
Yes, and we do a good job of it too. And sometimes people forget that they have other children. And really, they should be focusing on the children who are still alive. And you've just got to let go of the one you've lost, because he or she just isn't coming back. And even if you've made your mistakes, you have to forgive yourself and accept that you are not a perfect parent, and you couldn't have been, because there was never a book for you to read, nor university that you attended how to be a parent. We all had to do it on trial and error, and so did our parents in raising us. So even if we make a mistake, we have to be kind to ourselves and forgive ourselves, so we can move on and live for the children that are still around, for our spouse, and for other people who care about us, and we really should be showing more care for them.
And it's not just, parents and children in a familial sense, as in familial bonds. There are people who can, depend on us, and that people that we can help as well through whatever it is, through our work or through our personal, deal encounters with them. So it's really, in a sense, very self-defeating and selfish as well, to keep dwelling on the past and be burdened by that, and not using the resources that you have to actually help other people and to do some good in this world, right?
Yes. As they say, the most meaningful way to live is to live for others and think less of ourselves. And that way we can actually make our life much more purposeful, and we are able to touch people's lives in a positive way. It's not about taking as much as we can, but it's about giving as much as we can. And suddenly the whole world changes in front of us, and what we're able to do suddenly becomes much, much more than, when we're just focusing on what we want and how to get what we want. And that becomes such a myopic way of living.
Yes. I mean, when we focus on our pain and our suffering, we in a sense, we make it big, much bigger than we really are. When really, in the larger scheme of things, you're able to see we are really very minuscule. Each human being is so small compared to the immensity of life, in general. So if we can again look past ourselves and our lives and onto something that's greater, that is bigger, that's where we'll find our peace. And you have a passage that kind of like illustrates that very well.
The passage I'd like to share is about when we lose loved ones, we always think that we lose only the ones who grow old and aged, but it's not always the case. And so this passage is really dedicated to people who may have lost a child or someone young in their life. So the story is about a simple forest monk was meditating alone in the jungle in a hut made of thatch. Late one evening, there was a very violent monsoon storm. The wind roared like jet aircraft, and heavy rain trashed against his hut. As the night grew denser, the storm grew even more savage. First, branches could be heard being ripped off the trees. Then whole trees were uprooted by the force of the gale and came crashing to the ground with a sound as loud as the thunder. The monk soon realized that his grass hut was no protection. If a tree fell on top of his hut, or even a big branch, it would break clean through the grass roof and crush him to death. He didn't sleep the whole night. Often, during that night, he would hear huge forest giants smash their way to the ground, and his heart would pound for a while. In the hours before dawn, as so often happens, the storm disappeared. At first light, the monk ventured outside his grass hut to inspect the damage. Many big branches, as well as 2 sizable trees, had just missed his hut. He felt lucky to have survived. What suddenly took his attention, though, was not the many uprooted trees and fallen branches scattered on the ground, but the many leaves that now lay spread thickly on the forest floor. As he expected, most of the leaves lying dead on the ground were old brown leaves, which had lived a full life. Among the brown leaves were many yellow leaves. There were even several green leaves. And some of those green leaves were of such a fresh and rich green color that he knew they could have only unfolded from the bud a few hours before. In that moment, the monk's heart understood the nature of death. He wanted to test the truth of his insight, so he gazed up to the branches of the trees. Sure enough, most of the leaves still left on the trees were young, healthy green ones, in the prime of their life. Yet, although many newborn green leaves lay dead on the ground, old, bent and curled up brown leaves still clung on to the branches. The monk smiled. From that day on, the death of a child would never disconcert him. When the storms of death blow through our families, they usually take the old ones. They also take many middle-aged ones, like the yellow leaves of a tree. Young people die too, in the prime of their life, similar to the green leaves. And sometimes death rips from the dear life of a small number of young children, just as nature's storms rip off a small number of young shoots. This is the essential nature of death in our communities. It is the essential nature of storms in a forest. There is no one to blame and no one to lay guilt on for the death of a child. This is the nature of things. Who can blame the storm? And it helps us to answer the question of why some children die. The answer is the very same reason why a small number of young green leaves must fall in a storm.
And it's there that we see, the randomness of, destruction in nature, the process of renewal, and very often when we think of our own lives, we don't think we're part of nature, but we are. We are part of the whole design of life in a sense. So why should we be any different from, why should our lives be any different from the lives, say, of those green leaves?
Absolutely. I mean, we're 1 in 5 million in Singapore. Yeah. We're 1 in 3 billion. Yeah. In the world. So why do we exaggerate our own importance so much?
Well, thank you so much for that, Angie, coming in and sharing your thoughts on overcoming loss of loved ones and things we treasure. Thank you very much. Angie Monksfield is a chairperson of Brahm Centre, and Brahm Centre is a registered charity dedicated to offering education programs and activities that promote happy and healthy living. And their regular programs and services are offered free of charge so that they are accessible to all. So do check out the website for more information. It's brahmcentre.com, BRAHMcentre.com. You can get a link via my Facebook page as well. Search A Slice of Life under Pages in Facebook. All right, if you have anything to share with me on the show, do get in touch via email. It's eugene@mediacorp.com.sg. I'm Eugene Loh, and this has been A Slice of Life Hour on 938 Live.